I was the family failure, the son who threw his life away. He couldn't even afford a real suit, my brother laughed. Then the doors opened. A reclusive icon walked straight to me and said, "Silas, your project is approved. We're going national." The entire room went dead silent. The smell is the first thing people notice. It's a strange perfume, a mix of hot metal from the welder, the sharp bite of sawdust, and the faint, greasy scent of lubricating oil. To me, it smells like honesty. It's the smell of my world, my sanctuary, the forge. I was hunched over a workbench, my fingers expertly coaxing a bent bicycle wheel back into true. The rhythmic tink-tink-tink of the spoke wrench was a kind of meditation. Across from me, Leo, all of 16 years old with a chip on his shoulder the size of a brick, watched with grudging respect. He was supposed to be in school, but school had given up on him, and he'd found his way here. "You're barely even turning it," he mumbled, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "Don't have to," I said, not looking up. "You just have to listen. The wheel tells you what it needs. You force it, it'll just fight you back." He grunted, a sound that meant he understood. That was a victory. Victories at the forge were small, but they were real. They were forged in patience, not bought with money. Then the intrusion. A shrill, digital ringtone sliced through the calm symphony of the workshop. It was my phone. I wiped a streak of grease from my brow with the back of my hand and glanced at the caller ID. "Mom." I sighed and answered. "Hey, Mom. Silas, darling. I was hoping I'd catch you." Her voice was bright, a little too bright, like a light bulb buzzing right before it burns out. It was her pre-event anxiety voice. "I'm here," I said, my eyes drifting around the organized chaos of my shop. Tools hung on pegboards like surgical instruments. Half-finished projects, a repaired lawnmower, a welded table frame, a small fleet of bicycles, waited patiently for their owners. Good. "So, you haven't forgotten, have you? About Saturday?" I knew exactly what Saturday was. The royal wedding. The social event of the season for the Henderson clan. My brother, Marcus, was getting married. "No, Mom, I haven't forgotten." "Oh, wonderful. I was just telling your father. It's going to be such a lovely affair. At the Grand Alistair Hotel. Everyone will be there." She paused, and I could hear the gears shifting. "And darling, you'll make an effort, won't you? To look nice." There it was. Nice. The Henderson family code word. It didn't mean clean or presentable. It meant less like you, more like us. It meant hiding the calluses on your hands and pretending you spent your days looking at spreadsheets instead of fixing broken things. It meant, for one night, acting like you weren't a disappointment. "I'll do my best, Mom," I said. It was the same thing I said every time. "That's my boy." She sounded relieved. "We'll see you there. 7 o'clock sharp. Love you." The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment, the silence of a shop rushing back in. Leo was watching me. "Everything good?" he asked. "Peachy," I said, forcing a smile that felt like cracking plaster. My gaze fell on my workbench, on a small, private project I'd been tinkering with for weeks. It was a bird sculpted from scrap metal, nuts and bolts and twisted wires. It was intricate and delicate, with one wing bent at an unnatural angle, as if broken, but then painstakingly mended with a seam of shining silver solder. I reached out and ran my thumb over the repaired wing. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever made, and no one in my family would ever understand it. My apartment was the polar opposite of the forge. It was quiet, obsessively clean, and sterile. It was a place to eat and sleep, a holding cell between long, fulfilling days at the workshop. There were no half-finished projects here, no smell of honest work. There was just the faint scent of bleach and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. And there was the suit. It hung on the back of my bedroom door like a ghost, encased in a dry-cleaning bag that was probably worth more than the garment itself. I pulled it out. The fabric, a kind of shiny synthetic gray, caught the light in a way that screamed I was on sale. It was my only suit, purchased nearly a decade ago for a cousin's graduation. The lapels were a little too wide, the fit a little too boxy. I ran my hand over the cuff. Frayed, just slightly, but enough that I knew my mother would notice. My brother's fiancée, Amelia, would definitely notice. I was contemplating whether a black marker could solve the frayed cuff problem when a heavy knock rattled my apartment door. "It's open," I called out. The door swung inward, and my best friend, David, filled the frame. He was a contractor, a big, burly guy with a heart of gold and a complete inability to bullshit. He took one look at the suit in my hands and groaned, a deep, theatrical sound of despair. "Oh no," he said, shaking his head as he walked in. "You're not actually going, are you? I thought you'd have come to your senses by now. It's my brother's wedding, Dave. I can't just not go." "Why not?" he said, flopping onto my small couch. "What are they going to do, disown you again? You're feeding yourself to the wolves, man." "For what?" "For my mom," I said, laying the suit on my bed. "It makes her happy to see me pretend for a few hours. It's a goddamn circus, see? A pageant for them to show off how much money they have and how successful their prize-winning son is." He gestured at the suit. "And you're supposed to show up in that thing, and smile while they pat you on the head and ask if your little hobby shop is still keeping you busy." His words were harsh because they were true. Every word. Looking at that suit triggered the memory. It always did. It came back sharp and clear, like a shard of glass in my mind. I was 25, a year after I'd poured my life savings into opening the forge. My father, Mr. Henderson, had paid his one and only visit. He'd stood in the middle of the workshop, his polished Italian shoes looking terrified of the dusty concrete floor. He didn't touch a single tool. His eyes scanned the space, not with interest, but with the detached appraisal of an exterminator looking for nests. "A fine hobby, son," he'd said finally, his voice a smooth, deep baritone that could command boardrooms. It was the same voice he used on underperforming employees right before he fired them. "Keeps you out of trouble, I suppose." He had clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a judgment than an embrace. "Now, about that opening at my firm's logistics department. It's time to get serious about your future." I had just stood there, covered in grease and hope, and felt something inside me shrivel up and die. 10 years later, putting on this suit felt like wearing that exact moment on my skin. The Grand Alistair Hotel wasn't just a place. It was an assault on the senses. The air was thick with the scent of 1,000 white lilies, so heavy you could almost taste it. A string quartet was set up in the grand foyer, murdering a pop song with polite, passionless precision. The light from a chandelier the size of a small car glinted off so many diamonds, it was a miracle no one was blinded. This wasn't a wedding. It was a corporate merger with cake. I handed my car keys to a valet who looked at my 10-year-old sedan with a flicker of confusion before his professional mask slid back into place. I smoothed down my tie, feeling the cheap fabric of my suit like a second skin of shame. As I walked through the massive doors into the ballroom, I felt the immediate shift in atmosphere pressure. I had crossed a border into a foreign land, and I didn't speak the language. The first to spot me was my Aunt Carol. She gave me the look. It was a well-practiced art form in my family, a quick head-to-toe scan that took in my worn suit and my lack of a date in a single, comprehensive glance. It was followed by a smile that was all teeth and pity. "Silas, you made it," she chirped, before turning immediately to greet someone far more important standing behind me. Check. I had my own internal coping mechanism for these events. I called a Henderson wedding bingo. Pitying smile was the free space in the middle of the card. I scanned the room, a vast sea of tuxedos and shimmering gowns. I saw my parents at a VIP table near the front, laughing with a man who was probably a senator or owned a small country. My mother caught my eye, and her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She gave me a tense little wave, a quick, furtive gesture before my father said something in her ear, and she turned back to the conversation, her shoulders just a little bit stiffer. Obvious parental avoidance. Check. I started making my way towards the bar, my designated sanctuary. As I passed the table of my cousins, Amelia, my brother's beautiful, brittle fiancée, spotted me. She detached herself from her circle of friends and glided over. "Silas," she said, her voice like tinkling ice. She leaned in for an air kiss that landed about 6 inches from my cheek. Her perfume was expensive and suffocating. "So glad you could come. You look well." She was already looking over my shoulder, her eyes scanning for her next social target. Condescending air kiss. Check. She glided away, and I heard her whisper to one of her friends, a whisper that was calculated to be just loud enough to carry. I know, the suit is a tragedy. Bless his heart for trying. I felt a familiar heat creep up my neck. It wasn't anger anymore, not really. It was a deep, bone-weary resignation. I just needed one more square for bingo. A direct, unprompted insult from my Uncle Robert about my career choices. I decided to head to the bar and get a head start on numbing the inevitable. The bar was a safe zone, a place where you could stare into a glass of whiskey and pretend to be invisible. Or so I thought. The bar was an oasis of dark wood and gleaming brass in the sea of white and gold. I found an empty spot at the corner, my back to most of the room, and ordered a whiskey neat. I intended to make it last, to use the glass as a shield. For a few blessed minutes, it worked. I was just another man in a suit, a ghost at the feast. Then, a heavy hand clapped down on my shoulder. The gesture wasn't friendly. It was proprietary, a gesture of ownership. I didn't have to turn around. I knew the scent of the cologne, a sharp, citrusy fragrance that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Little brother. I turned slowly. Marcus stood there, a vision of tailored perfection in his custom tuxedo. His teeth were impossibly white, his smile perfectly calibrated to be charming and condescending at the same time. He was the golden boy, the finished product of the Henderson family ethos. Marcus, I said, my voice neutral. Congratulations. Thanks, he said, leaning an elbow on the bar beside me, crowding my space. Glad you can make it out of your, what do you call it? The workshop. He said the word workshop like it was something sticky he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. The forge, I corrected him quietly. Right, the forge, he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. He took at my suit, his eyes lingering on the slightly too wide lapels. Seriously, couldn't you have rented a decent suit? You look like you're here to fix the plumbing. I just took a slow sip of my whiskey, letting the burn slide down my throat. I refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. His smile tightened. My silence always annoyed him. Look, I get it, he said, lowering his voice into a tone of mock confidentiality. Things are tight, but you could have at least found a date. It's a little embarrassing, you know, showing up alone. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that was perfectly audible to the people nearby. Don't worry, I won't tell Mom you're still a charity case. That one hit. It was a low blow even for him. He was calling me a project, a problem to be managed. The word echoed in the silent space between us, filled with years of unspoken resentment. I could feel the eyes of the bartender, of the couple standing a few feet away. I felt that familiar shrinking sensation, the desire to disappear into the floorboards. I looked down into my glass, at the amber liquid swirling inside. I could let it go. I could just nod and let him walk away, the victor once again. It would be easier. It was what I always did. But tonight, something was different. Maybe it was the memory of my father's visit. Maybe it was the sight of that little mended bird on my workbench. Or maybe I was just tired. So very tired of being small. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get angry. I looked up from my glass and met his perfectly confident gaze. I held it until his smile faltered just a little. Then I said, my voice quiet but clear, you know, for a guy who has everything, you spend a lot of time worrying about the guy who has nothing. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation, and it landed with the force of a physical blow. I saw it in his eyes, a brief flicker of shock, then a flash of pure, unadulterated rage. The mask of the charming, successful brother slipped, and for 1 second, I saw the real Marcus, insecure and furious. He straightened up, his jaw tight. You're pathetic, he hissed, the words clipped and venomous. He turned on his heel and strode away, melting back into the crowd of adoring guests. I was left alone at the bar, the echo of his hatred hanging in the air. I had finally fought back, just a little, and all it had earned me was a deeper sense of isolation. I finished my whiskey in one gulp, the burn doing nothing to warm the cold knot in my stomach. The band, having finished their soulless rendition of a top 40 hit, launched into something slow and vaguely romantic. Marcus and Amelia took to the dance floor for their first dance, a carefully choreographed display of elegance and affection that looked like it had been rehearsed for weeks. The guests formed a circle, their phones held aloft like votive candles, capturing the perfect moment for social media. I stayed at the bar, an island in a sea of adoration. I was watching the spectacle, feeling a million miles away when it happened. The grand ballroom doors, two massive slabs of ornate wood and gold leaf, swung open with a quiet but decisive push. They didn't fly open dramatically. They opened with a sense of purpose, as if moved by a will of their own. A hush didn't fall over the room, not at first. But a change occurred. A subtle shift in the energy, a ripple that started at the back of the room and moved forward. Conversations closest to the door faltered. The sea of phones lowered slightly as heads turned. The band played on, oblivious for a few more bars, but the spell of the first dance was broken. Standing in the doorway was a woman. She was alone. She was probably in her mid-60s, with a severe, elegant bob of silver hair. She wasn't wearing a gown. She was dressed in a simple, impeccably tailored, dark gray pantsuit. It was Armani. I didn't know much about fashion, but I knew power when I saw it. She wore no jewelry, save for a simple, modernist watch on her wrist. She radiated an aura of immense, quiet authority. The ripple of recognition spread through the room like a current. I saw my father, who had been beaming at Marcus, stiffen. His smile vanished. I saw the man next to him, the one I thought was a senator, whisper something to his wife, his eyes wide. The name was unspoken, but it hung in the air, Eleanor Vance. She wasn't just a wealthy guest. She was a legend, an architectural icon, and a notoriously reclusive venture capitalist who was more likely to be featured in the Wall Street Journal than on a society page. Her presence here was an anomaly, a disruption to the natural order of things. The band finally petered out, the last note of the violin hanging in the suddenly silent room. Marcus and Amelia stood frozen on the dance floor, their perfect moment shattered. Eleanor Vance took a step inside. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the room. They passed over the glittering chandeliers, the fawning guests, the bride and groom, and my own parents, who looked like they were trying to will themselves invisible. Her gaze was not one of appraisal. It was one of dismissal. She was looking for something, and then she found it. Her eyes locked on me. Across the entire expanse of the ballroom, through the forest of stunned, silent people, her gaze found me, hunched over my empty whiskey glass at the corner of the bar. There was no flicker of confusion or doubt. It was the look of a hawk spotting its quarry. And then she began to walk. She didn't glide or stroll. She walked with a steady, unshakable purpose, her sensible but expensive heels clicking against the marble floor with a sound that echoed in the dead silence. Each click was a drumbeat, counting down to something I couldn't possibly imagine. Every eye in the room followed her, a silent, collective turning of heads. It felt like a dream, a slow-motion, surreal sequence that didn't belong in my life. She was a titan of industry, and I was me. It made no sense, but she kept walking, straight as an arrow, directly toward me. The world seemed to narrow until it was just the space between me and the approaching figure of Eleanor Vance. The faces of my family, of the other guests, blurred into a watercolor wash of confusion and shock. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on my back, but I couldn't turn away from hers. I stood up from the bar stool, an automatic, instinctual reaction. My hands felt clammy, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. What was happening? Was this some kind of mistake? Did she think I was a waiter? She stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could see the fine lines around her eyes, lines etched by decades of intense focus and high-stakes decisions. She wasn't smiling. Her expression was neutral, professional. She ignored my outstretched hand, which I quickly let drop to my side, feeling foolish. Her eyes held mine, and for a moment, she just looked at me, a quick, appraising glance that seemed to take in my frayed suit, my nervous posture, and something deeper, something I didn't even know was there to be seen. Then she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was perfectly clear, cutting through the suffocating silence of the ballroom with the precision of a scalpel. "Silas," she said. It was a statement, not a question. The sound of my own name, spoken with such authority in this place where I felt nameless, was a shock to my system. "My apologies for the public venue," she continued, her tone crisp and businesslike. "I just came from site visit." She paused, and her eyes flickered for a moment, a hint of something, satisfaction maybe in their depths. I saw all I needed to see. "The board and I are in agreement." I just stared at her, my mind a complete blank. Board? Agreement? What is she talking about? She delivered the next line without a hint of drama, as if she were discussing the weather. "The Forge Initiative isn't just a project we want to fund. It's the new national model." The words hung in the air, incomprehensible. The Forge Initiative? National model? Then came the final, devastating blow. The first-round funding of $10 million is a formality at this point. My office will be in touch with you on Monday to arrange the transfer. $10 million. If the room had been silent before, it was now a vacuum. The silence was so profound it felt like a physical pressure in my ears. I heard a sound from across the room, a fork clattering from a nerveless hand onto a china plate. It sounded as loud as a gunshot. I looked past Eleanora's shoulder, my eyes finding my family. My mother's hand was pressed to her mouth, her face pale with disbelief. My father was on his feet, his jaw muscle ticking furiously. But it was Marcus's face that I will never forget. He stood on the dance floor, his beautiful bride forgotten at his side. His perfect, confident mask had not just slipped, it had shattered. His mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide with a look of pure, uncomprehending horror. It was the look of a man who had just seen the laws of physics reverse themselves. The world as he knew it, a world where he was the sun and I was a distant, forgotten moon, had just been turned completely upside down. In that moment, he didn't see his embarrassing little brother. He saw a man who had just been handed a scepter of power, a man who had been anointed by a queen in the middle of his own coronation. He saw an equal. No, he saw a threat. And I, standing there in my cheap, worn-out suit, felt a strange, dizzying sensation. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't joy. It was vertigo. The floor had just dropped out from under me, and I had no idea where I was about to land. The vacuum of silence was broken by a sputtering sound. It was Marcus. "What is this?" he stammered, taking a step forward. His voice was a full octave higher than usual. "Some kind of joke? What are you talking about?" My father found his voice next. He strode forward, his face a mask of thunderous disbelief. He stopped a few feet away, addressing Eleanora, but looking at me with pure contempt. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice tight with forced civility. "There must be some mistake. With all due respect, my son, he runs a small community hobby shop. He fixes bicycles." He said the last part with a wave of his hand, as if describing a child's lemonade stand. Eleanora Vance did not flinch. She turned her head slowly, her gaze shifting from me to my father, then to my brother. It was a look of supreme, unbothered calm. "There is no mistake, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice dropping a degree, becoming colder, harder. "And your definition of value seems limited." She let that statement hang in the air for a beat, a quiet indictment of their entire worldview. Then, she turned her full attention to Marcus, who was still looking bewildered and furious. "Your brother," she said, her words precise and deliberate, "built something real from nothing. He created tangible assets, both human and practical, with a budget that wouldn't even cover your annual club membership dues. From an investment standpoint, that is a far better return than, say, that disastrous real estate venture your firm is currently championing." Marcus went white. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Eleanora's lips curved into something that was not a smile. It was the baring of teeth. The one leveraged with junk bonds? The one with the inflated appraisals from Shell Corporation? "My team flagged it 6 months ago. A piece of advice," she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that seemed to carry to every corner of the room. "Tell your boss to read the insolvency clause before the Q3 results are posted. It's a doozy." It was an execution. A clean, professional, public execution. She hadn't just validated me. She had systematically dismantled my brother's credibility with a few well-placed sentences. She had exposed the fragile foundation of his success while simultaneously cementing the legitimacy of mine. The room was a tableau of shock. Amelia was staring at her fiancé as if he were a stranger. My father looked like he had been struck by lightning. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The years of feeling small, of absorbing their judgment, of shrinking myself to fit into their world, it all just evaporated. The vertigo was gone, replaced by a strange, solid certainty. I straightened my shoulders. I felt the cheap fabric of my suit, but for the first time all night, I wasn't ashamed of it. I looked at my father, then at my brother, the fallen king on the dance floor. I stepped forward, not to hide behind Eleanora Vance, but to stand beside her. My voice, when I spoke, was my own. It was quiet, steady, and clear. It was never a hobby, Dad. I looked directly at Marcus, and for the first time, I think he really saw me. It was just the only work that ever mattered. Eleanora held my gaze for a moment, a flicker of something like approval in her eyes. Then, without another word to my stunned family, she gestured slightly with her head toward a set of glass doors leading to an outdoor terrace. A word, Silas? I nodded, feeling like I was moving in someone else's body. We walked past the frozen guests, past my dumbstruck parents and my humiliated brother. The silence parted for us like the Red Sea. The cool night air of the terrace was a relief after the stuffy, superheated atmosphere of the ballroom. Fairy lights were strung up in the manicured trees, casting a soft, gentle glow. The distant sounds of city traffic were a comforting hum. We stood there for a moment, not speaking. I finally found my voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. "Why?" I asked, turning to her. "Why me?" She leaned against the stone balustrade, her formidable public persona softening in the dim light. "I read your proposal months ago," she began, her voice losing its boardroom edge. "It was sent to my foundation by a third party, a social worker I trust. It was compelling. The numbers were sound, the model was scalable. But paper is paper." She looked out at the city skyline. "So last Tuesday, I came to the forge. I wore a headscarf and sunglasses. I parked my car across the street and sat there for 2 hours. My heart stopped. Last Tuesday, I thought back. It had been a busy day. The plumbing for the sink had backed up, and Leo had been having a terrible day. He'd gotten into a fight at school and was angry at the world. I watched you," Eleanora continued softly. "I watched you deal with a backed-up sink, 3 kids who needed help with their projects, and one very angry young man who looked like he was ready to punch a hole in the wall." "Leo," I breathed. "You didn't yell at him," she said. You didn't lecture him. You handed him a wrench, and you put him to work on that old engine you have in the corner. You gave him a problem to solve. You gave his anger a purpose." I saw his shoulders relax. I saw him focus. "You didn't save him, Silas. You showed him how to save himself." The professionalism in her face was completely gone now, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. That's when I knew. She reached into the inner pocket of her suit jacket and pulled out a simple leather wallet. From it, she carefully extracted a faded, creased photograph. The corners were soft from years of handling. She held out to me. It was a picture of a young man, probably in his late teens, with a wild mane of hair and a smile that was both brilliant and deeply troubled. He had her eyes. "My son, Michael," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she no longer tried to hide. "He was a beautiful, chaotic storm, and he was an addict. He died at 22 from an overdose." I stared at the picture, then back at her, speechless. "The only time I ever saw him truly happy," she whispered, "the only time he was ever at peace was in a place just like yours. A small, dirty community auto shop in a bad neighborhood, run by an old mechanic who let him tinker with engines. That place, it gave him 6 months of sobriety. 6 months of peace." She carefully tucked the photo back into her wallet. "I'm not just investing in a project, Silas. I'm repaying a debt to a memory. I saw in your work the same heart that saved my boy, if only for a little while. The $10 million, the public spectacle, my family shock, it all faded into the background. All that was left was this shared, sacred space between us. A space built not on money or power, but on a shared understanding of mending broken things. We didn't go back into the ballroom. There was nothing left to say. Eleanora's driver was waiting out front, and she offered me a ride, but I needed to be alone. I needed the familiar comfort of my own beat-up car. We shook hands, a firm, solid grip that felt more like a pact than a pleasantry. "My office will call on Monday," she said. And then she was gone, a phantom of immense power who had just detonated my entire life. The drive home was a blur. I don't remember the traffic or the route I took. My mind was a chaotic swirl of Eleanora's confession, the look on my father's face, and the ghost of a smiling, troubled boy named Michael. I got back to my silent, sterile apartment and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, the cheap, hated suit still on. The world felt tilted on its axis. Just as I was finally unknotting my tie, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It lit up with a text message, then another and another. It was Marcus. The first message read, "You think you won tonight?" The second, "You think you're clever. You brought a shark to my wedding to humiliate me. In front of my wife. In front of my entire life." I stared at the words, feeling a cold dread seep into me. This wasn't the triumphant gloating I might have expected. This was the sound of a wounded animal. The third text was longer. "After everything I've done for this family, keeping up appearances, making the money, being the son he always wanted, well, you got to play in the dirt with your little projects. You think you could just show up and tear that all down?" The last message was the one that made my blood run cold. It was short and direct. "This isn't over. I'll burn that little shack of yours to the ground." Metaphorically, of course. I'm a lawyer. I dropped the phone on the bed. The elation, the validation, the strange sense of peace I'd felt on the terrace, it all vanished, replaced by a familiar fear. He wasn't wrong. He was a powerful corporate lawyer with a vast network and a bottomless well of resentment. I was just a guy who ran a workshop. He couldn't physically burn it down, but he could destroy its reputation. He could poison the well. He could come after the one thing I had ever built that truly mattered. The battle wasn't over. A new one had just begun. It didn't take long. By Wednesday, the attack came. It wasn't a direct assault. Nothing as crude as a picket line or a lawsuit. Marcus was more surgical than that. It started with a post on a local business blog, one of those sites that masquerades as journalism, but is really just a platform for paid content and gossip. The headline was sanctimonious and alarming. Community haven or ticking time bomb? Questions raised about safety and finances at the Forge Initiative. The article was a masterpiece of innuendo and half-truths. It quoted anonymous concerned parents who worried about the lack of professional oversight. It mentioned unconfirmed reports of safety violations, citing the presence of welding equipment and power tools in an environment with teenagers. It questioned the financial transparency of the nonprofit, hinting darkly about where donations really went. It was all baseless, but it was crafted to plant seeds of doubt. It was designed to make me look either dangerously incompetent or secretly corrupt. My phone started buzzing with calls from the parents of the kids in my program, their voices filled with confusion and worry. A small local news station left a message. The story was starting to get legs. Marcus was poisoning the water, just like he'd promised. My first instinct was to panic. My second was to call Eleanor Vance and ask her army of lawyers and PR people to crush this. But then I stopped. That was their way of fighting. Big, loud, and expensive. It wasn't my way. Fighting them on their terms would mean I had already lost. I went to the Forge. The kids were there, looking at me with worried eyes. They'd seen the article. Leo walked up to me, his usual bravado gone. "It's bullshit, see," he said. "All of it." "I know," I said. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I didn't write a press release. I didn't hire a lawyer. I took out my phone, opened up the workshop social media page, and hit the go live button. The video was raw and unedited. The camera was a little shaky. "Hey everyone," I started, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "My name is Silas Henderson, and I run the Forge. A lot of you have probably seen an article about us today, and I wanted to address it. I walked through the workshop. They said they were concerned about safety," I said, panning the camera to the clearly marked, fully stocked first aid station, the fire extinguishers mounted on every wall, the locked cabinet for flammable materials. Here are our safety protocols. Every kid who comes in here goes through 3 hours of mandatory training before they're allowed to touch a power tool. They questioned our finances. I continued, walking over to the small, cluttered office. I pointed the camera at a binder on the shelf. Here's our ledger. Every single donation, every single expenditure. It's an open book. It always has been. We're a registered 501c3. Our tax filings are public record. I addressed every single allegation, not with anger, but with simple, verifiable facts. For the final shot, I turned the camera around. I didn't point it at myself. I pointed it at the kids. At Leo, who was now expertly tuning up a donated bike for a neighborhood kid. At Maria, who was learning to solder a circuit board. At a half-dozen other teenagers who were learning, creating, and finding a purpose. They looked up at the camera, their faces a mixture of defiance and pride. This is what we do here, I said, my voice quiet but firm. This is where your money goes. We don't tear things down. We build them. Then I ended the video. It was 5 minutes long. It was the truest thing I had ever said. The video didn't make national news. It didn't need to. It spread through our community like wildfire. People shared it. Parents called back, this time to apologize for doubting me and to offer their support. The local news station that had called for a comment ran a story, but this time it was about a community rallying around a beloved local institution. Marcus's smear campaign had backfired. He had thrown mud, and in response, I had simply shown everyone how clean my hands were. 3 months passed. They were a blur of meetings, architectural plans, and logistics. Eleonora's team was ruthlessly efficient, but she insisted I be at the center of every decision. This is your vision, Silas, she'd said. We're just the scaffolding. And then came the day of the groundbreaking for the new national headquarters of the Forge Initiative. It was being built on a derelict lot that had been an eyesore for decades. It wasn't a fancy affair. No string quartets, no champagne. Just a small stage, a few shovels decorated with blue ribbons, and a crowd of about 100 people from the community. The kids from the Forge were in the front row, their faces shining with excitement. David stood beside me, beaming, and slapped me on the back so hard I nearly fell over. I gave a short speech. I talked about second chances, about the dignity of working with your hands, and about how a community is only as strong as the opportunities it gives its children. As I finished and the crowd applauded, I scanned the faces. And I saw them. Standing at the very back, away from the main crowd, were my parents. They looked awkward and out of place, my father in a suit that was too expensive for the occasion, my mother clutching her purse like a life raft. They hadn't come to the front. They hadn't tried to speak to me. They were just there, watching. After the ceremony, after shaking 100 hands, I walked over to them. The space between us felt charged with years of unspoken words. My father looked at the large architectural rendering of the new building, then at me. The usual condescension was gone from his eyes, replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. Confusion? Respect? He cleared his throat. It's impressive, son, he said. The words sounded like they had to fight their way out. My mother's eyes were glistening with tears. We're proud of you, Silas, she whispered. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. I thought I would feel a rush of triumph, a desire to say, I told you so. But I didn't. I felt quiet. The war was over, and I realized I didn't need a victory parade. I just nodded. Thanks for coming, I said. It was enough. That night, I didn't go out to celebrate. I went back to the original Forge. The place was quiet and empty, smelling of sawdust and accomplishment. I picked up a broom and started sweeping the floor, the familiar, rhythmic motion of comfort. This was my ground zero. This was the place that had always made sense when nothing else did. The door creaked open. I looked up, expecting it to be David, but it was Eleonora Vance. She was dressed down in slacks and a simple cashmere sweater. She was holding 2 steaming paper cups. I figured you'd be here, she said, handing one to me. It was black coffee, just how I liked it. We stood there in comfortable silence for a long moment, sipping our coffee, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 repaired and reborn objects. He called me. You know, she said quietly. Your father. He wanted to discuss becoming a potential investor. I looked at her, surprised. What did you say? I told him we weren't accepting unsolicited proposals at this time. She said with the faintest hint of a smile. Some things aren't for sale. I smiled back. A real, genuine smile. I looked down at my hands, calloused and stained with grease, holding the warm paper cup. I thought about the wedding, about the $10 million announcement, about the feeling of being saved. And I realized it was the wrong word. I never needed a savior to rescue me. I just needed an architect to recognize the foundation I had already poured, stone by painful stone. The real victory wasn't the money or the public validation, or even my family's grudging respect. It was the quiet, unshakable knowledge, right here in the silence of my workshop, that I was standing on ground I had built myself. I had found my own worth long before anyone else had ever thought to look for it, and it was unbreakable,